with a government, it's a different deal because the government issues the money. So the government has to live up to its means, not within its means, and up to its means. Given the incompetence of governments, in my lifetime, we've always run way below capacity. We've always had lots of resources that could be used to serve public purpose, which haven't been used. Because the government, instead of using the resources that are available now, employing labour that could be used productively, it's simply not doing that because it's got stupid fiscal rules and things that have no application, that they don't understand. What they really need is understand the system and then really do some actual budgeting. And step one would be use all the resources they've actually got.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Dr. Phil Armstrong, and in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about recent events in the world of government budgeting, among other things. I just wanted to jump in here to let you know that Phil and Patricia and myself, we're all going to be at the Anti-austerity Conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September. The whole event can be attended online or in person. Other confirmed speakers include Stephanie Kelton via Zoom, and in person we've got the magnificent Stephen Hale, Zach Polanski from the Green Party, Mark Hooper from Plaid Cymru, Jeff Tilley, the senior economist for the TUC, Jaideep Pandit, who is a professor of anesthesia at the University of Oxford, who did a great presentation at last year's MMT conference about NHS budgeting, and many more contributors. So look forward to seeing you there. Stephen Hale will also be teaching a workshop in Amsterdam on the 14th of September, a 2-day workshop in Sheffield on the 20th and 21st of September, and another 2-day workshop in Vienna on the 27th and 28th of September. I'll link to all of those things in the show notes, where, as ever, there'll be a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview. The full-length interview is available now, along with many other patron-only episodes on our Patreon feed. And as I always say, because I always mean it, thanks as ever for your support and for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to be joined today by our friend, economist and author, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Thanks so much for joining us today, Phil.
Brilliant to be with you, Christian and Patricia, as always. Many thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. And we're chatting because on the 12th and 13th of September, all three of us are going to be participating in the Anti-austerity Conference, which is in Bristol, but it can also be attended online. I think we'd all agree that MMT is the anti-austerity economic paradigm. All other schools of thought bake in austerity via the acceptance of some level of unemployment, underemployment, and or under-resourcing of public services on the basis that the government is always just on the brink of running out of money or running out of people to lend it money. MMT cogently shatters that way of thinking, so accept no substitutes when it comes to your anti-austerity economic paradigm, because there are a few cheap knockoffs out there. But anyway, the subtitle of the conference is a famous John Maynard Keynes quote from a radio talk that he gave in 1942. Many people are calling it the MMT podcast of its time. But anyway, the line is, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Phil, for anybody new here, what do we as MMT people mean when we say that?
Well, I think it's crucially is contrasting the government, which issues money, with households, which use money. So obviously, you know, many of the listeners out there, maybe their parents had said to them when they were young, you have to live within your means. You've got to earn enough money to pay for your outgoings. And if you borrow too much, you're in trouble. Now, that sort of live within your means, it's got a lot of connection to people's everyday experience. But with a government, it's a different deal because the government issues the money. So the government has to live up to its means, not within its means, and up to its means. Means that, so I'm using the word means a lot there, but the government basically faces real resource constraints. And when Keynes was obviously writing, and 1942, we were at war. And the problem for Britain in those days was a shortage of resources. So basically, if we didn't have enough guns and tanks and soldiers to fight the Germans, we would be in trouble. And if we had guys who wanted to join the army, are physically fit and ready to go, the government would say, oh, well, we're not going to employ them. We're running out of money. I mean, the whole idea is nonsensical. So from the government's point of view, if we have the real resources as a nation, then we should employ them. The government spends by, as your listeners will know, by data entry. So if we have a lot of skilled, unemployed nurses sitting at home, ready to work in the health service, the government can key the money in, as it always does, always spends that way. It's not a change in policy, and employ them as nurses. What has society lost? Nothing, because they weren't doing anything. So basically, from the government's point of view, it's issuing the money. It's not constrained by money. It's data entry. It's constrained by the real resources that we as a nation have got available and the political will to use them. So that's really anything we can do, we can afford. And I know that Keynes was very keen when he was talking about saying that we should have good public services, theatres, and all the things that we need to enrich our lives. And if we had the resources after the war, when we did, and we did that, given Britain was in a terrible state after the Second World War, we were still able to have a health service, to build loads of houses, because we used all the real resources we had pretty much to develop the economy. Now we have lots of unreal resources, people ready, willing and able to contribute, who are left not contributing because the government doesn't understand the monetary system. So that's how I would put it anyway. I don't know if you want to add a bit there.
Let me just follow up on that. They don't understand the monetary system, because I know that you are very much into the ontology of money, i.e. what money is in essence. And there's this other Keynes quote that takes a bit of decoding because it's written in early 20th century clever person language. And anyway, here it is. Quote, this is Keynes back in the day. Quote, the state therefore comes in first of all as the authority of law, which enforces the payment of the thing which corresponds to the name or the description in the contract. But it comes in doubly when, in addition, it claims the right to determine and declare what thing corresponds to the name and to vary its declaration from time to time when, that is to say, it claims the right to re-edit the dictionary. This right is claimed by all modern states and has been so claimed for some 4,000 years at least. It is when this stage in the evolution of money has been reached that chartalism, the doctrine that money is peculiarly a creation of the state, is fully realized. Today, all civilized money is, beyond the possibility of dispute, chartalist. End quote. Now that is a real mouthful.
Now that quality, I don't know where it's from, but if I was forced to guess, I would say A Treatise on Money, Volume 1, some of the early points. I don't know.
Yes, I think it is, yeah.
And it's basically saying that the state has the right to name the unit of account. So, like, whatever, it's an abstract unit. It might start off as a real unit, a bit like, I don't know, a foot might start off as the distance between some ruler's elbow and their wrist or something like that. I don't know. But say that they were calling it that, or maybe if they had a very big foot, it could be the actual foot themselves. I don't know the origin of that, but it becomes a standardized unit, 12 inches, and that's the unit. And things could be measured in feet or whatever. So what they would do is the state would organize and name a unit of account, an abstract unit of account, and that is the pound. And then it would issue money things in pounds, shall we call them coins. And the state decides the unit, pounds, and the things that you could pay your taxes in denominated in that unit, the pound. In the old days, the unit they used most of the time was the penny because pounds are too big. In medieval England, for example, what people did spend pennies, little tiny silver pennies. And they would say, right, the penny is this coin, they would issue it, and then you would have to pay your taxes in that penny. But the crucial thing is, as Keynes said, that they can re-edit the dictionary. If they decided on a different unit, they decide, well, okay, we're not going to use pounds anymore, we're going to use dollars. They could say, right, well, okay, you got to pay your taxes in dollars now, and we're going to issue new coins denominated in dollars. And then people would have to get hold of those dollars to pay their taxes. So the state's always in charge.
In fact, I think that the choosing the name dollar was thumbing their nose at the monarchy over here in England, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it came from the Spanish dollar originally. But yes, it was a sort of an American dollar breaking away from Britain. And that, in a way, is what states like to do. They like to name their own unit, which gives them a sense of identity. Then they demand taxes in that unit. So then, at that point, if you have to pay a tax to the state denominated in a particular unit, then you have to go work for them or sell them goods and services to get that unit to pay your taxes. So once you've named the unit of account, you've levied a tax in that unit, then people have got to work for you or suffer the penalty of non-payment of taxes. So it's essential with the provisioning process that the state names the unit, then spends in that unit and collects back in that unit. And that's how the system basically works.
Can you tell the difference between, because I often hear this phrase, anybody can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. I think that comes from Minsky, if I'm not mistaken. Is there a difference between money and currency? Because I've always made that distinction of currency being the money that the state creates. Or is that irrelevant, you think?
Yeah, defining your terms is difficult. I mean, I've heard so many variants on different definitions. For me personally, I tend to think of currency as the actual stuff, the money things.
You mean cash?
Cash, yes. But whether or not that's what everybody does, I don't know. For me, money is just a credit. So it's just, if you like, you're holding somebody else's debt. So it's a credit to you and a debt to them. But that's only my view of what currency is.
That happens to be Alfred Mitchell Innes's view as well, right?
Yeah. You could call currency the actual name of a unit, like foreign currency or something like that. You could say, well, they've got a different unit. But all these words can get extremely complicated in defining your terms. But I've never really thought too much about, until you mentioned that, Patricia, I've never thought about what currency is relative to other phrases people use, like bank deposits, cash.
Maybe a way to cut through the confusion is to say that the government issues that which it demands in payment of taxes. And that which it demands in payment of taxes is, Patricia is saying, yeah, I would call that currency. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. But I think a way to cut through it is to sort of concentrate on how the tax payments are cleared. And they're cleared here in the UK when the consolidated government receives a payment in reserves, right? And the consolidated government is the monopoly issuer of reserves, central bank money. So to me, that simplifies the whole thing. And that kind of goes to, well, the government must have to put those reserves into the system first before anybody can pay any tax, basically.
Yes. I mean, what is quite interesting about that is that, going back to the coin thing, it's so obvious when you were using coins as currency or cash that the state had to issue them before it could collect them. Because if the non-government sector decided to produce them themselves, that would be counterfeiting. It's totally illegal. So you could see that the government had to mint coins before they could be taken back. The original American government, the revolutionary government, when they were issuing their early money, paper money, they had to spend it first. And then when it was given back in taxes and the taxes were redeemed, it was burnt. And I think it's, even in the Finding the Money film, they have like a picture, as I recall, of that paper money being burnt when it's paid. There's no more use to it. Once the taxes is paid, you can burn it. And because the revolutionary government They were a bit shaky in the early days, so they promised to convert it into gold at some point in the future. They thought the idea was, let's get as much of it back in taxes and burn it so we don't have to convert it into gold. But the whole point, it's obvious, unless people are counterfeiting money in huge amounts, then the government has to spend before it can tax, which means that Thatcher's famous quote from the 83 conference, the government has no money of its own, is completely and wrong, can be proven wrong. It's not like politics where most of us disagree with her politics. But in this case, it's obviously she's got it the wrong way round. And to me, all these people who think taxes, inverted commas, tax revenue flowing into the government is put somewhere to spend, they are the counterfeit crew to me. They're people who actually must believe that the private sector now is counterfeiting state money. And all of these are sort of free market guys. So basically, that's what they think must be happening. I guess that all this money's been counterfeited. Are they crazy?
All right, so let's pull ourselves out of the partial rabbit hole we went down there. Anything we can physically do, we can afford. But by we, it's us as a democratic society, hopefully democratic society. Where we vote representatives into power to do things that they campaigned on, like, I don't know, not kick disabled people off benefits, fund the NHS, renationalize key industries. And if after we voted those politicians into office, they tell us, actually, we can't do any of those things because there's no money to do those things, we know they're lying. The government spends via money creation. In fact, that's the only way the government can spend. So a chancellor and a prime minister and a health secretary trying to get the country to worry about fiscal black holes would be laughable if the consequences of austerity weren't so deadly. But anyway, Patricia, I was going to ask you if the government can afford to buy anything priced in pounds without operational limit. And like Phil said earlier, the actual constraint on government spending is when there isn't anything left to buy in pounds, right? Given that constraint, the real resource constraint, the inflation constraint, given that constraint, and this is a big question, I apologize for it, how should the government go about budgeting?
Well, first of all, I think just getting rid of unemployment is the priority. And it's very difficult to target unemployment just with discretionary spending. So you need something like the job guarantee, basically, to make sure that you reach everybody and that everybody has an opportunity for employment. But aside from that, once you've got that covered and say you want to provision a service, then you need to see what resources there are available. I guess in the context of a full employment economy, you may need some taxes to, for example, if you want to expand health services or you want to expand any other services, and you need to hire people to do that. But of course, if everybody's already employed, then you might need to make fiscal space first. And what does that mean? It means to deprive the private sector of some consumption in order for the government to be able to consume so that it can provide that service, right?
We could say invest rather than consume when it comes to the government, right?
Yeah, I mean, the government has this kind of, it divides spending into a day-to-day spending, what I guess you would call consumption, and then into capital spending, which is investment. But you're right in that it is a very arbitrary classification. So, for example, the wages of teachers would be considered day-to-day spending. But of course, you can always also think of wages of teachers as an investment in children's futures, right? So I guess consumption is given the impression that it's kind of wasteful. And the point is that the government is using resources in order to provide a service. What service that is, I guess, will depend on the priorities of people, right? It may be something that is kind of universally agreed that is really useful, like education or healthcare. But it may also be something that is just for leisure. I don't know. They want to open more places for people to relax and have fun. And maybe that's not a super priority, but that's just what the electorate wants and is willing to mobilize resources for that when the government needs to make fiscal space to do that. But I think what I wanted to highlight was that the budgeting is not in the same way that a household would do it, where you say, well, okay, I've got to spend £1 million here, therefore I need to first save or raise £1 million from somewhere. It's not pound for pound. You need to make sure that the private sector is consuming less resources so that the government can make use of those resources, but that does not translate into taking the like-for-like money it may mean taking more. It may also mean taking less. It really depends on what industry you're directing that spend into. What is it that you're trying to achieve? So it really depends on your industry. So at the moment, we don't really have a really good detailed understanding of what each industry in the UK is doing, like what productive capacities there are in each industry and how each industry connects with one another. I think it's starting to come through with using things like input-output modeling and things like that. But traditionally, it's been considered that kind of granularity into your policy is considered central planning. You get pretty much called Stalinist if you even start talking about industries and stuff like that. Because it's kind of assumed that, well, the government will just know how to allocate these resources between industries. So why even bother talking about whether industries are doing what they should be doing?
Is this what you're finding then? Because I know that this is what you're looking at for your PhD. There's just no agency, there's no information out there about what the government's real resource budget is.
Yeah, I mean, I am speculating as to the reasons why. There may be more reasons, right? Maybe Phil can fill in here in my speculation, but there is a lack of kind of honing in on looking into industry and what they call industrial planning, industrial policy, and about looking at the UK and thinking not just, okay, these are the industries we have. So the approach that I feel the government takes and the UK, consecutive UK governments have taken is seeing, well, the City of London is growing, hence I'm just going to help that and I'm going to build it a road or I'm going to build a train. And that has kind of, it's almost a pro-cyclical kind of approach to investment where you see what industry is growing and you run in there to support it.
It's already doing well.
Yes, exactly. So you go in there to support it because you're saying, well, the market is guiding me towards the light, right? And all I need to do is kind of support that growth. Instead of saying, what industries do we need? And there may be industries that we need that are not doing very well. And actually, that's where you need to invest. For example, the steel industry is a good one, right? Because the UK has moved away from manufacturing. But you can argue that steel is relatively important in Warren's words, strategic industry, in the sense that, say, God forbid, the UK is in a serious war at home tomorrow, and we need to produce weapons, and a lot of these weapons still rely on a lot of the use of steel. Well, do we really want to be importing steel from our potentially would-be enemies if that was the case? And so is it worth, at the very least, making sure that we retain the ability to make steel so that we can expand that industry should we need to? It's just that kind of a strategic thing. And it can be, I mean, I'm talking about war and national security issues, but it can literally be any kind of national priority you may have. It may be cultural issues. For example, the French really want a film industry and they protect the French film industry against the dominance of the Hollywood film industry. And that's an entirely cultural thing, right? And you may think, okay, it's not as important as national security, but it's important to them. And that's the thing. It's a matter of national priority, and you need to look at what industries you have and where do you want to be in relation to where you are now, and then think, okay, well, what investment can I do to make sure that industries thrive in the way that I think they should thrive, and what resources I need to make available to deliver that? And we're really not thinking in those terms at all right now.
Do you hear Warren's thing about a little analogy about the economy being like a giant department store?
I haven't heard it, no.
Oh, well, basically, it's basically what you said, but it's one of his little nutshell things where he said, imagine like all the private sector in a giant department store buying all the resources and all the stuff, all the labor, all the resources were needed. And basically, there were no resources left for the government to like have a health service or to have an army or to do all the things that we need to be provided publicly. So what the taxes would be doing was freeing up those resources. So you tax people, like you were saying, so that the people in the private sector who are consuming all these resources now are poorer. So the resources aren't there anymore. So now the government can buy them at existing prices. So they're not using the money. They're just making the private sector poorer so that those resources are available for the government to buy, in particular labour, which obviously does resonate in a sense they're unemployed, seeking work in the government's currency. They've got to come to the government to get that work. So that's the whole point, that in a way we elect our governments on a democratic platform and we expect them to provide the services that they've said they would, or we hope they will. And therefore, they need it in principle to tax the private sector sufficiently to release the resources for them to do that. Then you get the technical aspects, which goes back to your work, Patricia, and I don't envy you, is how are you going to apply the taxes in the right areas at the right rates to actually release the resources for the government to use to serve public purpose? Now, that's a difficult question. And that's the question that politicians should be asking. They should be saying, right, we need more nurses. What taxes do we need to levy in which places to release the labour to be the nurses if we haven't got enough of them? And obviously, if they have got enough of them now, they're already there unemployed, then this is anything they can do, they can afford. They can employ those nurses now. We don't need taxes. But obviously, at full employment or near full employment, then you would need the taxes to release. But obviously, they think in their budgets, it just in terms of money. So their whole budgetary process, they are imagining that they're like, and I remember Rachel Reeves talking to that, sitting around the table with a mum or something, looking at books. And now this is a great story, and she's going to employ to the British economy. I mean, it's crazy. It's a real resource. So it's all about real resources, and the taxes are there to release the right amount of real resources to serve public purpose, as you know all too well, Patricia, and with your work.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
Well, just to illustrate what I mean when I say when you tax, it's not necessarily like for like. You may tax less, you may tax more, you may tax elsewhere. Just to give you the reasons for that is that where you're directing that tax changes the effect of that tax on consumption. So, for example, every industry behaves different for very many reasons. One of them is potentially the fact that they had what they call elasticity of price on demand, or I think it's demand on price. I always get it the other way around. But basically, how much demand for a specific good may change depending on how the price changes. So if a product is highly sensitive to price and demand, then you may only need to tax a little bit to deter a lot of consumption in their industry. Or if a product is not very sensitive at all to price changes, as many basic products are not, then you may need to tax a lot in order to be able to deter consumption in their industry. But that's just one of the things. There are many other things. So some industries are more energy intensive, some industries are more labor intensive. If what the government is planning to do is very labor intensive, then you might want to tax in a way that targets industries that are quite labor intensive in order to free up labor. Or you may want to tax industries that use up something that is critical to what you're doing. And some prices, like in Isabella Weber's paper, she was talking about systemically significant prices and pointing specifically to energy as one of them. There are other ones, and usually it's like to do with raw materials and things like that. But energy is a very big one. So you tax energy, you have a huge impact, on the prices of goods in other industries, and therefore on the consumption of goods in other industries. And you change the whole makeup of consumption in the economy. So all these things need to be modeled. And that's, as Phil says, that's kind of what my PhD is about, trying to model these interdependencies in order to know how to tax and spend in a way that achieves our targets to do best resource allocation management. It's very difficult, and it needs to consider your particular economy's makeup and the kind of interlinkages between industries, and which are different for every single country. And not just in terms of the internal interdependencies, but also in terms of what you import and what you export. And all this will have an impact on it. So it's a huge thing, but we need to get there.
Well, I'm glad it's you doing it, Patricia. I don't know how you feel about that, Christian, but that sounds pretty hard work.
Yeah, I look forward to unpacking it when the work's done and maybe being able to keep up with half of it or maybe 10% of it.
And the thing is that I'm going really knee deep on the detail, right? But I have a suspicion, and I guess we'll see. I have a suspicion that what MMTers like Stephanie Kelton have been saying about managing inflation and just simply looking at what resources you have already available, it kind of rules of thumb of saying, well, if it's available, you can just use it or spend it, and then there's little risk of inflation and all this stuff that may take you 90% of the way there. Right. And what I'm doing simply gives you that extra 10% confidence, or maybe 5% confidence there.
That's my gut feeling, in a way that in my lifetime, and I'm a lot older than you two, of course, we talk a lot about the need to tax to free up resources for the government to use, and it's actually true. But given the incompetence of governments, we're generally living, because people haven't understood Keynes in 1942, in my lifetime, we've always run way below capacity. We've always had lots of resources that could be used to serve public purpose, which haven't been used. So, yeah, we may at some point need to start doing this taxing to free up the resources we need, etc., etc. Yeah, quite possibly. And in certain strategic areas, quite possibly. But in general, to me, there's plenty of resources available without having to pay tax at all. It's because the government, instead of using the resources that are available now to spend at current prices, not inflationary, employing labour that could be used productively, it's simply not doing that because it's got stupid fiscal rules and things that have no application, as we've said, I think, several times before. That they don't understand. What they really need is understand the system and then get Patricia in the office there to explain how to really do some actual budgeting. And step one would be use all the resources they've actually got first, stating the obvious.
So just to get back to the thread then, so just break it back down to basics again. Whatever we do with taxes, taxation happens after the money's been spent into existence. Right. That's the high level view, basically. And another thing that then it also happens after the money's been spent into existence by the government spends by money creation. And what I wanted to move on to now, because it's kind of relevant to what's happened recently, what I wanted to ask you is, if the government spends by money creation, what's happening when the government does this thing the financial press like to call government borrowing?
Well, I mean, I think what's actually happening is, if you want to call it borrowing, it's taking the money it's already spent. And you could, I guess, call it borrowing back the money it's already spent and giving them a different form of money. So, for example, in the old days under the gold standard, the government might spend some money, which is convertible into gold, hence the gold standard. And then they might be thinking to themselves, well, hang on a minute, these guys have got convertible currency, and they might come and convert that money into gold, and then we will lose our gold reserves, and we can't then continue to issue as much money because it has to be backed by gold. So we'll offer them a deal. We'll say to them, look, okay, we will swap that convertible currency that you've got for a thing called a government bond, and you can't convert that into gold. And in order to kind of make you feel better about not being able to convert it into gold, we'll give you an interest rate. So they were effectively, I suppose, I've only just thought about it now, they were sort of borrowing back what they'd already spent. Not because they needed to kind of get the money to spend again. They can issue us if they want. But what they had to do was prevent that convertibility into that money being converted into gold and depleting gold reserves. So you could imagine then that it was operation required for people to sell these government bonds to drain that convertible currency out of the system. And it's still called borrowing, and it still serves the same purpose, that you would sell bonds or to drain reserves from the system. But it used to be required to maintain interest rates, because for reasons I won't go into now, we've probably mentioned before. But it's no longer required, because if you go to the Bank of England now with a £10 note and ask to convert it into gold, they will send you away. And they'll say, go away, you're crazy, you can't do that, there is no gold. So consequently, we don't need now to borrow, inverted commas, people's money back and give them a bond. So that's the whole debate of whether we need to sell bonds anymore. And it's kind of open to discussion.
That's kind of where I was going with it now, because the currency isn't convertible now. It's floating exchange rate currency. And the government spends by money creation. I'm going to keep emphasizing that. Sorry if you hear me say it a million times. But we should also emphasize those pounds that are buying those government bonds, they can only have come from the government in the first place. Like we said at the beginning, the government spends money into existence. And when you pay your taxes, you are returning to the government what it's already spent into existence. So that the pounds to buy government bonds can only have come from the government in the first place. So I'm not going to call it borrowing. I'm going to say the government's taking pounds from private sector individuals and firms that they are willingly exchanging for higher interest bearing pounds, known as bonds or gilts, in return. Now, given that there's no gold supply to defend or anything like that, what economic purpose does it serve now? And I know you touched on it, Phil, so maybe I'll turn to you, Patricia, to drop this one on you. I want people to just have a sense of why the government is issuing and intervening in the secondary market for bonds. I mean, at the moment, they're probably doing quantitative tightening, right, at the moment. But
have they started already?
I think they might be doing that now.
They're unprinting money.
Yeah. But I just wanted to give the listener, if they're relatively new or not entirely got their arms around this concept, they're basically, it's about interest rates, as you said, Phil.
Yeah. But I think that the BBC was saying something about, I can't remember the headline, but it was, they were calling borrowing everything that the deficit, the difference between spending and taxation was all borrowing. And I think that is probably true now because of the way that the Bank of England was changed after the UK joined the EU. Kind of the Treasury had to issue bonds corresponding to the deficit. And then the central bank buys and sells in the secondary market to target an interest rate. Whereas before that was all one single step, so that the deficit didn't necessarily match the bonds issued.
Right. And the deficit can't match the bonds issued to the penny, right? Because they're anticipating what the deficit might become, right? So it's not going to be pound for pound, is it?
Right. Yes. But I think that this is a bit that is a bit hazy for me. Maybe Phil can clarify. But am I right to say, Phil, that before that change in Britain joined the EU, that it was the Bank of England that carried out the issuance of bonds into the market? Or am I wrong in that?
I know the Debt Management Office, which is an aspect, it's a relatively new thing. Whether it was anything to do with the membership of the EU, I honestly don't know. But yes, this one-for-one idea of selling bonds to match as closely as possible to your deficit, to my knowledge, is a relatively recent thing with the Debt Management Office. I mean, they've always sold bonds to drain reserves from the system, mainly. So if you imagine it, that it's kind of like if the government's selling bonds, then there has to be the right level of reserves in the system for those bonds to be bought. So the Bank of England would have to make sure that the level of reserves in the system was the correct amount to sell the bonds. So they would have to do repos or introduce reserves into the system, not making it too complicated, or so that there was enough reserves for the things to move about. So in a way, as Warren says, they're offsetting measures. So in a way, the sale of bonds was always in the literature from these institutions designed to manage the amount of reserves. And it was recognized by the people actually doing these things But it wasn't about governments borrowing money to spend. It was ensuring that the level of reserves in the system was the correct amount. Because in the old days, Britain had a very archaic system where what would happen, we had these things called discount houses, and discount houses discounted bonds, and I bought them for less than their face value. So people who wanted to get money now would sell them a bond a bit lower than it was going to be worth in the future. So the discount houses would give the sellers of these bonds money now, so they got cash in hand, and they would wait for the bond to mature, and that would be their profit. So what would happen with these is that banks that had extra reserves would then lend them to the discount houses. But obviously, if there wasn't sufficient reserves in the system, which the Bank of England would deliberately engineer, so it would sell bonds, drain reserves from the system. So the banks haven't got enough reserves. So what they would do is say, well, okay, we're really in trouble now. We haven't got enough reserves to settle our debts with each other. So what would have to happen is they would call in the money from the discount houses that they'd lent for them. So what would happen is the discount houses, and I remember when I first started teaching, there was the biggest discount. They've all closed down now, but it was Grand Union. And this chap from Grand Union on the film, he put a top hat on, and then he had a nice little waistcoat and a tailcoat, and he would walk down the road to the Bank of England and say, I need to borrow some money from you, reserves, to repay the banks. And then the guy would look on a very old-fashioned computer, it was like the size of a house, and say, yeah, okay, you can have 55 million overnight, and name the rate. And that was the base rate, and that triggered the system. So those reserves were then available to the banks, and they could then settle their debts, and everything worked like that. So the buying and selling of bonds was to manage the amount of reserves in the system, to make the discount houses have to go to the Bank of England so they could signal the interest rate. And they were called, quote, in the bank. Now, you might think that is a crazy way of doing things. And it was entertaining. So obviously they've changed that now. So banks can actually borrow directly when they have to from the Bank of England. And so obviously when they were short of reserves, the Bank of England would lend them at a certain rate. That was their cost of funds and everything else. So bonds were critical in those days in managing the amount of reserves in the system so that the Bank of England could influence interest rates. Nowadays, as you all know, since QE has introduced these huge amounts of reserves, then that function isn't really required anymore. And so, again, you might say, well, we don't really need bonds anymore to manage interest rates the way we used to. So do we need them at all? And you might say, well, okay, they might be handy, some people said, because they are safe assets. So they're safe assets for pension funds. Or you might think, well, if you have a 30-year bond, the rate on that gives you a risk-free 30-year rate to act as a benchmark. Or government bonds might be used as collateral, and traditionally institutions view government bonds as collateral. So will we have to replace them for those reasons? So there are reasons one might argue for bonds, but none of them have got anything to do with the government getting hold of money from the private sector to spend. It's all about other reasons, and the word borrowing is a total misnomer. It's just shifting money from one form to another, from a current account to a savings account when you buy a bond. And then when it matures, you click the button and it goes back again, a bit like buying a premium bond. So it is a little bit frustrating. It kind of goes back to the point that Patricia was talking about, the word currency or bonds or borrowing. It's unpicking these words. And some of them are very powerful in creating an image in people's heads, this idea that the government is somehow having to get money to provide the things we need. And somehow we're taxpayers, so we're somehow in the future going to have to pay more taxes so they can pay that. When in fact the system works entirely in reverse, that the national debt owns an asset to the private sector, not a liability. And the word is the wrong one, and it causes trouble.
I mean, any given week, at least once on the sort of breakfast business news, when people talk about gilt yields, one commentator, analyst will say, oh, gilt yields went up. And then the non-expert will chime in and go, that means the government's borrowing costs went up, just to sort of help the listener out. And it's like, no, that's completely not what's going on there at all. And I'm asking about this stuff because a few weeks ago, we had a situation where bond yields went up because the Chancellor cried in public. And because the Chancellor's imposed fiscal rules on herself that lower the government's nominal, not actual spending capacity when bond yields go up, her being visibly upset in that moment put her and the government in the position of not being able to deliver the policies they were voted in to deliver without breaking their own fiscal rules. So if the government's ability to do what it was voted in to do, which is off and on again, depending on bond traders' emotions about the Chancellor's emotions, I think that's anti-democratic. But what's the lesson? Should the Chancellor keep trying different facial expressions until bond yields get to the right level? Is the Chancellor's face the real constraint on government spending?
Well, a lot of things seem crazy, but in reality, what bond markets think's going to happen for whatever reason then alters yields. I mean, particularly what they think the government's policies will have on inflation, because their basic idea is, well, if we think there's going to be inflation, then we expect the Bank of England will raise interest rates. So if they raise interest rates overnight, then they'll demand a higher interest rate on a bond. They're not going to buy a bond with a lower interest rate than what they can get overnight. So they will bid lower for the yields. And that's got nothing to do with the size of the government's deficit or anything like that. It's purely whether they think that the Bank of England is going to have to raise interest rates. And therefore, then, well, that'll be because what we think is going to happen to inflation, whether or not they think the Chancellor is capable of dealing with inflation. So I guess you could say, well, okay, the Chancellor's crying, doesn't look very confident. Therefore, we think she's not going to be able to deal with inflation. Therefore, we think the inflation rate's going to go up. So therefore, the interest rate will go up. So therefore, we're going to expect long-term bonds to be cheaper. So we're going to bid lower on it. So that's the change. So I reckon, yes, it's all about, that's the way these guys are working, crazy though it seems. So why doesn't the Bank of England just set the rate on bonds, if they're going to have them at all, set them at 1 or 2%, fix them there forever, and then the banks and bond traders have to take it or leave it. You can buy them and get 2% or not buy them and get nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's either that, Phil, or we get like one of those Mission Impossible kind of masks made of Rachel Reeves, like happy and smiling, and she just wears that all the time when she's in Parliament.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've probably mentioned before, but you might remember, it's a long time ago, there was a little comedy TV show where somebody had looked at Jimmy Carter with his State of the Union speech, and he had a load of graphs, like what he thought inflation would be and what he thought GDP growth would be and what unemployment would be. And he went through the graphs and he explained them, not in too much detail, but a reasonable amount of detail about why he thought it would happen, etc., etc., etc. And then Ronnie Reagan, and he used to be like in adverts on posters with his big beaming white smile, and he just turned his head at one side, looked at the audience and went, "Trust me, folks, it's all going to be fine." And that was it. And he was actually more successful because it was the opposite of Rachel Reeves. He beamed a big smile with that Brylcreem quiff he had, and everyone thought, oh, Ronnie knows what he's doing. And so everything was fine. And so maybe that's the art. We need a big beaming smile and just tell everyone everything's going to be great.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.